April 28, 1945. Somewhere in the British occupation zone, Western Germany. The air inside the camp smells of mud and disinfectant. A line of women stands outside a concrete building, silent, their heads down. Their uniforms are torn, stained with weeks of travel and surrender. Some wear the gray of Wehrmacht auxiliaries. Others, the field blouses of signal corps, administrative staff, anti-aircraft units. A few still bear the insignia they haven't been allowed to remove. An Allied officer unlocks the door to the shower block. Steam drifts out into the cold morning. The women don't move at first. They've learned not to expect kindness. They've learned that doors opening can mean many things. But this time, the guard steps aside. He says nothing, just nods toward the water. One woman enters, then another. The sound of running water echoes through the camp, and for the first time since the Reich fell, no one speaks. Not the guards, not the prisoners, not the officers watching from across the wire, because in that moment, something shifts. Something no war manual prepared them for. To understand that silence, you have to go back. By March 1945, the Third Reich was no longer a nation. It was a dying organism convulsing across two collapsing fronts. In the east, Soviet armies had crossed the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. In the west, American and British forces had breached the Rhine and were racing through the German heartland. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel. The Wehrmacht was a patchwork of old men, children, and whoever could hold a rifle. But among them were women. Hundreds of thousands of them. They had been there all along, woven into the machinery of the Nazi war effort in ways the world hadn't fully grasped. They were not front-line soldiers in the traditional sense, but they were embedded within the military structure. They served as Nachrichtenhelferinnen, signal auxiliaries, operating radios, switchboards, and teleprinters that kept entire army groups connected. They worked as Luftwaffenhelferinnen, manning searchlights and plotting air defense maps, while Allied bombers screamed overhead. Some served in the Kriegsmarine, tracking convoy movements. Others were assigned to administrative roles, managing supply depots, processing documents, encoding messages. And then there were those in darker roles, women who served in concentration camp staff, women in the SS Helferinnen Corps, women who had seen things, done things, or stood by while others did them. The Nazi state had mobilized women not out of progressive ideology, but necessity. Total war demanded total participation. By 1945, over 500,000 women were part of the Wehrmacht auxiliary services. They wore uniforms. They took orders. They were part of the machine. And when that machine broke apart, they became prisoners. The collapse came fast. In early April, Allied forces overran German positions so quickly that entire units surrendered en masse without firing a shot. Roads became rivers of retreat. Soldiers, civilians, vehicles, all moving west, away from the Soviets, toward the Americans and British. Amid this flood were women in uniform, sometimes in organized units, sometimes alone, stripped of rank and purpose, trying to disappear into the chaos. But they couldn't. The uniforms gave them away. The documents in their pockets, the unit patches still sewn onto their sleeves. Allied intelligence had known about German women in auxiliary roles, but the scale of it, seeing them in person, in the hundreds, then thousands, was something else entirely. Officers accustomed to processing male POWs suddenly faced a logistical and moral puzzle. What do you do with enemy women? How do you guard them? Where do you house them? Do the same rules apply? The Geneva Convention said yes. Prisoners of war, regardless of gender, were entitled to humane treatment. But theory met reality in the mud of hastily erected camps, where resources were stretched thin and the psychological toll of the war's final weeks weighed on everyone. Most of the women captured in late April had been on the move for days, sometimes weeks. They had slept in ditches, walked through bombed-out villages, gone without food or water. Their uniforms were caked in dirt. Their hair was matted. Some were injured. Others were sick. All of them carried the exhaustion of a lost war in their eyes. When they arrived at the camps, they were searched, photographed, catalogued, their names recorded, their ranks noted, their stories, for now, left untold. They were placed in barbed wire enclosures, sometimes separated from male POWs, sometimes not. Tents were pitched, latrines dug, rations distributed. The camps swelled daily as the Wehrmacht dissolved and the net tightened. And in those early days, there was no bathing, no privacy, no dignity, just the slow, grinding machinery of captivity. The camps were never designed for this. Most of the Allied POW facilities in Germany had been set up rapidly, built to handle the sudden influx of surrendering Wehrmacht soldiers in the final weeks of the war. They were open-air enclosures, often nothing more than fields surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Tents, if available, mud always. The logistical strain was immense. By late April 1945, the Western Allies were holding hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, and the numbers grew by the day. Then came the women. At first, they were mixed in with male prisoners. British and American officers, unprepared for their presence, scrambled to create separate sections. Barbed wire was strung hastily across camp sections to divide the sexes. Female guards were requested but rarely available. Male guards, young soldiers fresh from combat, now found themselves responsible for enemy women, some of whom were their age, some older, some visibly traumatized. The moral complexity was immediate. These were not the women the Allies had imagined. They were not civilians caught in the crossfire. They wore uniforms. They had served the Reich, but they were also starving, exhausted, and terrified. Many had been bombed, shelled, or assaulted during the retreat. Some had witnessed atrocities. Others had participated in them. Allied commanders faced a question with no clear answer. How do you treat an enemy who is also a victim? The International Red Cross began visiting the camps in early May, documenting conditions. Their reports noted overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and a lack of medical care. Female prisoners, they observed, were in particularly poor condition. Many had not bathed in weeks. Their clothing was filthy. Lice infestations were common. Dysentery spread quickly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. But water was scarce. Soap was scarce. Everything was scarce. The Allied supply lines were stretched, supporting the ongoing occupation, the feeding of displaced civilians, and the processing of millions of POWs. Female prisoners were a low priority in a system already at breaking point. For the women themselves, captivity was a strange, disorienting limbo. They had gone from being part of a militarized society, where they had roles, tasks, orders, to being nameless numbers behind wire. The ideological certainty that had sustained many of them was gone. The Führer was dead. The Reich had fallen. What remained was only survival. Some clung to defiance. They sang Nazi songs quietly at night, whispered that the war wasn't truly over, that some miracle would come. Others collapsed into silence, refusing to speak, refusing to eat. A few tried to blend in, claiming they had been coerced, that they were just clerks, just typists, that they hadn't known. And perhaps some of them hadn't. The Nazi system had been built on layers of complicity, where ignorance was both a shield and a lie. But the Allies had already begun uncovering the camps. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, and the images of skeletal prisoners and mass graves were being seen by every soldier, every officer, every guard. There was rage in the air, a desire for justice, and little patience for the excuses of those who had worn the uniform. Yet there were protocols. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment. Orders came down from higher command. No abuse, no retribution, no collective punishment. Feed them, house them, process them. Let the courts and tribunals sort out guilt later. But in those first weeks, before the bureaucracy caught up, before the trials began, there was simply the reality of human beings in squalor. Women who had not washed in a month, who had not changed clothes, who lived in the smell of their own filth and the filth of others. And then, in late April, a decision was made. At one of the larger camps in the British zone, records suggest it may have been near Lüneburg or Paderborn, an order was given to prepare the shower facilities for the female prisoners. It was a practical decision, driven partly by health concerns. Lice carried typhus. Dysentery thrived in filth. If disease broke out, it would spread to the guards, to the camp staff, to the surrounding towns. But it was also something else. An acknowledgement, perhaps unspoken, that these women were still human beings, that even enemies, even the defeated, deserved basic dignity. The order filtered down. Guards were assigned. Soap and towels were requisitioned. The shower block was cleaned, checked, prepared. And on a cold morning in late April, the first group of women was told they would be allowed to bathe. Who were these women? That question haunted the camps. It haunted the officers writing reports. It haunted the guards who walked the wire at night. Because the answer was not simple. Some of them were true believers. Women who had joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel as girls, who had absorbed the ideology of blood and soil, who had volunteered for service with pride. They had believed in the Führer, in the destiny of the Reich, in the righteousness of the war. For them, the uniform had been an honor. They had worked long hours in freezing bunkers, operating radios under bombardment, plotting aircraft on maps while the walls shook. They had done their duty, as they saw it, for a cause they thought was just. Others had been swept along, conscripted, in effect, though the word was rarely used. By 1943, Nazi authorities had begun compelling young women into auxiliary service. Refusal meant suspicion, harassment, sometimes worse. If you were of age, healthy, and unmarried, you served. It was presented as patriotic duty, but the pressure was absolute. For these women, the uniform was not ideology. It was survival. It was what you did to avoid being labeled defeatist, shirker, traitor. And then there were those whose roles had been darker. Women who had served at Ravensbrück, at Auschwitz-Birkenau, at Bergen-Belsen, camp guards, overseers. Women who had beaten prisoners, who had selected them for death, who had watched the chimneys burn and gone home to dinner. Not all female POWs had served in such places, but enough had that the question lingered over all of them. What did you do? What did you see? What did you allow? The problem was that guilt did not announce itself. A signals operator who had worked in Berlin and a guard who had worked at a sub-camp in Poland wore similar uniforms. Both were prisoners now. Both were hungry, exhausted, filthy. Both had the same hollow eyes. The Allies were beginning to sort them out. Interrogations were conducted. Names were checked against lists being compiled from captured SS documents, from survivor testimonies, from the records of the camps. But this took time. Weeks, months. In the meantime, they lived together behind the wire. For many of these women, the collapse of the Reich had also been a collapse of self. They had spent years inside a totalitarian system that told them what to think, how to behave, what to value. Their identities had been fused with the state, and now the state was gone. They had lost the war, lost their country, lost their futures. Some were in shock, unable to process what had happened. Others cycled through denial, This couldn't be real. This couldn't be the end. But the filth was real. The hunger was real. The wire was real. And in that reality, something else began to surface. Shame. Not political shame, not yet. That would come later, during the trials, during the reckonings. This was a more immediate, physical shame. The shame of being seen in this condition, of being unwashed, unkempt, reduced to an animal state. In Nazi ideology, women had been celebrated as bearers of the race, as symbols of purity and order. Even in auxiliary service, there had been an emphasis on discipline, cleanliness, appearance. Uniforms were to be kept neat. Hair was to be tidy. The body was a reflection of the strength of the Volk. Now they were covered in lice. Their hair was greasy and matted. Their skin was gray with grime. Their clothes stank of sweat and fear and defeat. Some had stopped caring. They sat in the mud, vacant-eyed, waiting for nothing. But others clung to whatever scraps of dignity remained. They tried to wash their faces with rainwater. They braided each other's hair with trembling fingers. They shared the last pieces of soap smuggled from home, hoarded like gold. Because dignity, even in captivity, was a form of resistance. Not against the Allies. There was no fight left for that. But against the disintegration of the self. Against becoming only a number. Only a body. Only a symbol of defeat. When the order came that they would be allowed to bathe, the reaction was mixed. Some didn't believe it. They had learned not to trust promises from captors. Others were afraid. Afraid of what it meant. Afraid of being vulnerable. Afraid of the guards watching. A few wept quietly, not from relief, but from the weight of finally being seen as human again. The women selected for the first group were told to line up. No explanation was given beyond the basic fact. They were going to the showers. They would be given soap. They would be allowed time to wash. They stood in that line, silent, heads down, and waited. And in that waiting, something ancient and unspoken moved through them. A need older than war, older than nations. The need to be clean, to be whole, to feel, even for a moment, like a person again. For the guards, this was uncharted territory. Most of them were young men. British infantrymen, American GIs, soldiers who had fought their way across France, through the Ardennes, over the Rhine. They had faced enemy fire. They had seen friends die. They had liberated concentration camps and witnessed horrors that would never leave them. And now, they were told to guard women who had served the same regime responsible for those horrors. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. These were the enemy. They wore the uniform. They had been part of the machine. Yet they were also women, starving, frightened, defeated. Some of the guards had wives back home, mothers, sisters. The instinct to protect women was deeply embedded. A cultural reflex that clashed violently with the reality of who these prisoners were. Orders were clear. Treat them according to the Geneva Convention. No physical abuse. No deprivation beyond what security required. But orders didn't address the emotional turbulence, the confusion, the quiet anger that simmered beneath the surface. Some guards were hardened by what they had seen. They had walked through Bergen-Belsen, through piles of corpses and walking skeletons. They had looked into the eyes of survivors who could barely speak. And now they were supposed to show mercy to women who might have been complicit in that suffering, who might have turned the other way, or worse, participated. There was little sympathy in those first days. The guards kept their distance. They delivered rations without speaking. They watched the wire but avoided eye contact. To acknowledge the prisoners as individuals would be to acknowledge a complexity they were not ready to face. But the conditions were impossible to ignore. The women were sick. Infections spread. The stench of the camp grew unbearable. Medical officers began reporting concerns. If disease took hold, it wouldn't stop at the barbed wire. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, they didn't care about nationality. The decision to allow bathing wasn't an act of compassion, not officially. It was preventive medicine, a calculated move to preserve order and health. But in practice, it required something more difficult, allowing these women a moment of vulnerability, of humanity. When the order came down, some of the guards were relieved. Anything to improve the conditions, to reduce the smell, to make the camp more bearable. Others were uneasy. Supervising showers meant proximity. It meant standing outside the facilities while women undressed. It meant hearing the water run, the quiet sounds of relief or weeping that might come from within. It also meant seeing them afterward, seeing the transformation. The British sergeant assigned to oversee the first group was a man named Thompson. Records are incomplete, but his account was recorded in a later interview. He had fought at Normandy, had seen combat through France and into Germany. He had no love for the enemy. But when he unlocked the door to the shower block that morning, he felt something he hadn't expected. Pity. The women shuffled forward, eyes down. They didn't speak, didn't ask questions. They just waited for permission to enter, as if afraid it would be taken away. Thompson stepped aside and watched them file in, one by one. Some were barefoot. Others wore torn boots held together with cloth. Their clothing hung off skeletal frames. He was supposed to wait outside while they bathed, to stand guard, to ensure order, to prevent any incidents. But what struck him most, he later said, was the silence. From inside the building, as the water ran, there were no voices, no laughter, no relief, no conversation, just the sound of water, and occasionally, very faintly, the sound of someone crying. He realized, standing there, that he had never thought about what it meant to be a female prisoner of war. The manuals didn't cover it. Training didn't prepare for it. The enemy was supposed to be faceless, abstract. But now the war was over, and the enemy had become people. Broken, humiliated, stripped of everything. When the women emerged, they looked different. Not just cleaner, but somehow more present. Their hair was wet, slicked back. Their skin, though still pale and marked by malnutrition, no longer carried the gray film of weeks without washing. They had been given clean clothes, donated garments, mismatched and too large, but clean. Some of them carried the soap they had been allowed to keep, clutching it like treasure. Thompson and the other guards said nothing. They escorted the women back to their section of the camp in silence. No orders were shouted. No commands barked. Just a quiet procession through the mud. Later, in the guards' barracks, the men didn't talk about it. There was an unspoken agreement not to, because to talk about it would be to admit that something had shifted, that the clear lines between captor and captive, between victor and vanquished, had blurred in a way that was uncomfortable. One of the younger soldiers, an American corporal, wrote a letter home that week. He didn't describe combat. He didn't describe the camps. He wrote about the silence, about watching enemy women walk to the showers and realizing he didn't know how to feel anymore, about the weight of witnessing suffering, even when that suffering belonged to the enemy. His letter ended with a single line. I don't think anyone prepared us for this part. Because this part, the aftermath, the occupation, the daily reality of guarding people who had lost everything, was not glorious. It was not simple. It didn't fit into the stories they had told themselves about what war would be. It was just human beings, on both sides of the wire, trying to make sense of what came next. The morning was cold and overcast. Late April weather in northern Germany. Gray skies, damp wind, the kind of chill that sinks into bones already weakened by hunger. The women had been told the night before, tomorrow you will bathe. Be ready at dawn. Some didn't sleep. They lay on the ground, staring up at the canvas of the tents, or at the open sky if they had no shelter. They thought about water, about soap, about the simple, impossible luxury of being clean. Others were afraid. Rumors moved through the camp like shadows. What if this was a trick? What if the showers were something else? The women had heard the stories from the East. the whispers of what the SS had done. Gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. They knew the methods of extermination because their own regime had perfected them. Could the Allies do the same? It was an irrational fear, perhaps. But fear in captivity is never fully rational. It grows in the absence of control, in the uncertainty of every order, every movement, every opened door. At dawn, the guards came. They called out a list of names. 50 women, then another 50. The lists had been prepared carefully, prioritizing those who were sick, those whose conditions posed the greatest health risk, those who had been in captivity the longest. The women assembled in silence. They stood in rows, shivering in the morning air, clutching whatever belongings they still had. A few carried small bundles, letters, photographs, things they refused to leave behind even for an hour. The guards led them across the camp. Mud squelched underfoot. The wire stretched endlessly in every direction. Watchtowers loomed, but the women kept their heads down, following the path, their breath visible in the cold. And then they saw it. The concrete building, steam rising from vents near the roof. The door, heavy and metal, slightly ajar. They stopped. The line of women stood frozen, staring at the building. No one moved forward. The guards gestured, spoke in English or broken German, urging them on. But still, they didn't move. Because in that moment, memory collided with hope. The memory of what showers had meant in the camps they'd heard about. The hope that this time it was real, that the water would be water, that they would walk out again. One woman, near the front of the line, finally stepped forward. She was older, perhaps in her 40s, a former administrative officer whose uniform was now torn and faded. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the door. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the others. Then she stepped inside. The guards waited. The women waited. Seconds passed. Then a minute. The sound of running water began, pipes groaning to life, steam billowing thicker from the vents. And then the woman reappeared at the door. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her face said everything. It was real. It was safe. It was water. The line began to move. One by one, the women filed into the building. Inside, the air was warm, warmer than anything they'd felt in weeks. The room was tiled, utilitarian, built for function, not comfort. Shower heads lined the walls. Benches sat in rows. There were hooks for clothing, drains in the floor, and along one wall, a table stacked with bars of soap and rough towels. The guards had left. This was important. The decision had been made by the camp commandant that morning. No male guards inside during the bathing. Female personnel, if available, would supervise. If not, the women would be left alone, trusted not to cause trouble because where would they go? The wire still surrounded them. The war was still lost, so they were alone. 50 women in a concrete room with running water. For a long moment, no one moved. They stood there, still dressed, still filthy, staring at the shower heads as if they might vanish. Then slowly, one woman began to undress, then another, then all of them, shedding the uniforms that had defined them, the clothing that had marked them as enemy, as prisoner. As defeated, they stepped under the water. It was lukewarm, not hot. The camp's heating capacity was limited, but it was enough. It poured over heads, over shoulders, over skin that hadn't felt water in weeks. The grime began to wash away. The smell, the layers of sweat and fear and exhaustion, all of it running down into the drains. And that's when it happened. The silence. Outside, the guards stood at a distance. They could hear the water running. They could see the steam rising. But they heard no voices. No laughter, no conversation, no sound of relief or joy, just silence. Deep, heavy, absolute silence. Inside, the women washed in a kind of trance. Some scrubbed their skin until it turned red, as if trying to erase more than dirt. Others stood motionless under the spray, eyes closed, faces upturned, letting the water do the work. A few wept quietly, shoulders shaking, tears mixing with the water. But no one spoke, because there were no words for what this was. Not relief, that was too simple. Not gratitude, that implied a transaction, a kindness offered and received. This was something older, something primal, the return of a piece of humanity that had been stripped away. For weeks, they had lived as animals, sleeping in filth, eating from their hands, relieving themselves in ditches. They had been numbers, categories, problems to be processed. They had been enemy combatants, ideological zealots, complicit participants in a regime of horror. But under the water, in that concrete room, none of that mattered. They were just bodies, just human beings, just women who needed to be clean. The water continued to run. Some of the women remained under the spray for minutes, maybe longer. Time had lost meaning. There were no clocks, no schedules beyond the rhythm of survival. They stayed until their fingers pruned, until their skin tingled, until the cold air outside seemed like a distant memory. Others moved to the benches and began the work of truly cleaning themselves. They took the bars of soap, plain military-issue soap, nothing special, and worked them into lather. They scrubbed their arms, their legs, their faces. They washed their hair, working their fingers through tangles and knots that had formed over weeks of neglect. Some helped each other, wordlessly. One woman held another's hair while she rinsed. Another passed soap to someone who couldn't reach. There was a tenderness in these gestures that defied everything the war had been. These were women who had served opposite sides, who had come from different cities, different backgrounds, different levels of complicity. Some had been fervent believers. Others had been coerced. A few might have been guilty of crimes that would later see them hanged. But here, in this moment, they were simply women caring for one another in the most basic way possible. The soap ran out quickly. 50 women, 1 bar each if they were lucky, sometimes less. When it was gone, they used only water, scrubbing with their hands, trying to remove every trace of the camp from their skin. The towels were rough, thin, military surplus, but they were clean. The women dried themselves slowly, carefully, as if the act itself was sacred. And then came the clothing. The camp had managed to gather a collection of donated garments. Dresses, blouses, skirts, some from relief organizations, some from confiscated German civilian supplies. None of it matched, none of it fit properly, but it was clean. And it wasn't a uniform. The women dressed in silence. A former signals operator put on a floral dress 2 sizes too large. A Luftwaffe auxiliary wore a gray wool skirt and a man's button-up shirt. They looked at themselves, at each other, and something shifted in their expressions. Not happiness, that would have been too much, but a faint recognition. A glimpse of who they had been before the war consumed everything. When they finally emerged from the building, the guards were waiting. But they weren't the same guards who had led the women in. Word had spread through the camp. Other soldiers had come to see, not to gawk, not to mock, but to witness something they couldn't quite name. The women walked out into the cold morning air, their hair wet, their faces clean, wearing mismatched civilian clothes. They moved differently than they had an hour before. Their shoulders were slightly straighter. Their steps were less shuffling, less defeated. They weren't soldiers anymore. They weren't prisoners in uniform. They were just people. And the guards said nothing. Thompson, the British sergeant, stood near the building's entrance. He had overseen hundreds of prisoner transfers, had processed thousands of POWs. He had seen men surrender, seen them broken and weeping. But this was different. He watched the women file past, and he felt something crack inside him. Not pity exactly, but a recognition that the war had done this. That the machinery of nations and ideologies had ground these people down to nothing, and now, in the aftermath, all that remained was the slow, painful work of restoring what had been lost. One of the women, young, maybe 20, with short dark hair still dripping, looked up at him as she passed. Just for a second, her eyes met his. There was no defiance in that look, no plea, just acknowledgement, human to human. And then she looked away and kept walking. Thompson turned to one of the younger guards, an American private who had been watching in silence. The private's face was unreadable. After a moment, he spoke quietly. "My sister's about her age." Thompson nodded. He didn't say anything. What was there to say? The second group of women was already forming up, waiting their turn. By the end of the day, over 300 women would pass through the shower block. Each group the same silence, the same careful, deliberate washing, the same quiet emergence. Word spread through the camp. The male POWs, separated by wire, heard what was happening. Some reacted with bitterness. Why did the women get special treatment? Others understood. A few of the older men, veterans who had survived the Eastern Front, simply nodded. They knew what it meant to lose everything, including dignity. They knew what it meant to have even a small piece of it returned. By evening, the camp felt different. The guards noticed it first. There was less tension in the air, fewer hollow stares from behind the wire. The women who had bathed sat in small groups, combing each other's hair, talking quietly for the first time in weeks. Not about the war, not about guilt or innocence, just small things, memories of home, recipes, songs half remembered. The camp commandant, a British colonel named Hartley, walked the perimeter that night. He stopped at the section where the women were housed and stood watching through the wire. One of his officers joined him. "They seem different, sir." Hartley nodded slowly. He had been a soldier for 23 years. He had fought in the trenches of the Great War, had seen the worst of what men could do to each other. And now, at the end of this war, he was seeing something he hadn't expected. "They're people again," he said quietly. "That's what you're seeing." The officer didn't respond. They stood there in the fading light, listening to the soft murmur of voices from inside the camp. Somewhere, someone was singing. Not a Nazi anthem, not a patriotic song, just a lullaby, the kind a mother might sing to a child. And for the first time since the camp had been established, there was something other than defeat in the air. There was the faint, fragile beginning of recovery. The bathing continued for 3 days. Group after group, morning to evening, the women cycled through the shower block. The routine became familiar. The guards no longer stood as rigid, no longer watched with the same wary suspicion. The women no longer hesitated at the door. They knew now what awaited them inside. They knew they would emerge changed, even if only in the smallest ways. But the silence remained. Every group, without exception, bathed in near total silence. It was as if speaking would break something fragile, something that couldn't yet be named. The medical officers noted the change immediately. Rates of lice infestation began to drop. Skin infections, which had been spreading rapidly in the filth of the camp, started to stabilize. The women were still malnourished, still weak, still carrying the physical toll of collapse and captivity. But the immediate crisis of disease had been averted. More than that, behavior shifted. The women became more responsive during roll calls. They formed lines without being forced. They accepted rations without the blank, defeated stares that had characterized the first weeks. It wasn't compliance born of fear. It was something closer to resignation, an acceptance that this was now life, and life required participation. The camp staff began to notice other things. The women organized themselves. They created informal leadership structures within their sections, older women taking responsibility for younger ones, former officers quietly managing the distribution of blankets and food. They cleaned their areas without being ordered to. They buried their waste properly. They helped each other mend clothing, share rations, tend to the sick. It was as if the act of being treated with basic humanity had reminded them how to be human. But not everyone saw it that way. Among the guards, reactions were mixed. Some were relieved that the camp was running more smoothly, that the tension had eased. Others felt uneasy, even resentful. These were still the enemy. They had still served the Reich. Did they deserve kindness? Did they deserve dignity? One evening, a heated argument broke out in the guards' mess hall. An American corporal, fresh from liberating Buchenwald, confronted a British lieutenant who had ordered extra soap rations for the women. "You're treating them like victims," the corporal said, his voice tight with anger. "They're not victims. They wore the uniform. They knew what was happening." The lieutenant, older, quieter, didn't rise to the bait. He set down his cup and looked at the corporal. "Some of them knew," he said. "Some of them didn't. And some of them did things that will see them hang. But that's for the tribunals to decide, not us. Our job is to keep them alive until then." "Your job," the corporal shot back. "My job was watching skeletons crawl out of barracks begging for food. You want me to feel sorry for these women because they got a shower?" The mess hall went quiet. The lieutenant didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was measured. "I don't want you to feel sorry for them. I want you to do your duty. And your duty, Corporal, is to follow the convention. Whether you like it or not." The argument ended there, but the tension didn't. It ran through the camp like a fault line. On one side were those who saw the female POWs as people who had lost everything and deserved basic decency. On the other were those who had seen the camps, who had walked through the evidence of genocide, and could not reconcile mercy with memory. Both sides were right. Both sides were wrong. The war had created a moral landscape where clarity was impossible. Meanwhile, the processing continued. Intelligence officers began conducting formal interrogations. Each woman was questioned about her service record, her unit, her duties. The answers varied. Some were cooperative, offering details willingly. Others refused to speak, invoking their rights under the Geneva Convention. A few lied, claiming they had been civilians, that they had only worn the uniform to avoid persecution. The officers cross-referenced names with captured documents, with lists being compiled from liberated camps, with testimonies from survivors. Slowly, patterns emerged. Most of the women had served in support roles, communications, logistics, administration. They had been cogs in the machine, essential but distant from the worst atrocities. But some names triggered alerts. A woman who had served at Ravensbrück, another who had been stationed near Auschwitz, a third whose name appeared on a roster of personnel involved in medical experiments. These women were separated, moved to different sections, marked for special attention. Their fates would be decided later, in courtrooms, under the scrutiny of judges and prosecutors. For now, they remained behind the wire, waiting. And through it all, the women continued to bathe. Once a week now, on a rotating schedule, the shower block had become a ritual, a marker of time, a moment when they could shed the camp and remember what it felt like to be clean. The guards stopped watching so closely. They trusted the routine. They had seen that the women returned quietly, that there were no incidents, no attempts to escape or resist. The silence had become normal, expected. But inside the building, the silence still carried weight. It still meant something the guards couldn't see from outside. It meant grief. It meant shame. It meant the slow, painful reckoning with a world that had collapsed and a future that was uncertain. It meant being human again, even when being human was the hardest thing of all. By mid-May 1945, the war in Europe was officially over. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Nazi government had dissolved. On May 8th, the Allies declared victory in Europe Day. Across Britain and America, there were celebrations, parades, fireworks, crowds dancing in the streets. The nightmare was over. The world could begin to heal, but in the camps, nothing changed. The wire was still there. The watchtowers were still manned. The prisoners were still prisoners. If anything, the end of the war made their situation more uncertain. They were no longer enemy combatants in an active conflict. They were remnants, leftovers, the human debris of a defeated regime. The question of what to do with them became more urgent. The male POWs would be sorted, some released, some held for labor battalions to help rebuild, some transferred to tribunals for war crimes investigations. But the women presented a unique problem. There was no precedent, no clear policy, no infrastructure designed to handle tens of thousands of female prisoners. The British and American zones began coordinating. Lists were compiled. Categories were created. Low-risk personnel, clerks, typists, those with no evidence of direct involvement in atrocities, would be processed for eventual release. Medium-risk personnel would be held longer, investigated more thoroughly. High-risk individuals, those with connections to concentration camps, SS units, or specific crimes, would be transferred to holding facilities awaiting trial. For the women themselves, this bureaucratic sorting was slow and opaque. They were called in for questioning, sometimes multiple times. Their stories were checked and rechecked. Some were released within weeks, given papers, and told to return to their homes, if their homes still existed. Many German cities had been bombed into rubble. Families were scattered. The country itself was divided, occupied, transformed. Others remained in the camps for months. The summer of 1945 was hot. The tents became stifling. Water was rationed more carefully now. The emergency of war had passed, and with it, some of the urgency to maintain humane conditions. The camps were supposed to be temporary, but temporary stretched on. The weekly bathing continued. It was one of the few constants. The women marked time by it. Monday was bath day, or Wednesday, depending on the section. They looked forward to it not because it was pleasant, but because it was a break from the monotony, a moment of privacy, a reminder that they were still alive. But the emotional toll was deepening. As the weeks turned to months, as the initial shock of defeat faded, the women began to confront what had happened. Letters arrived from the Red Cross when they could be delivered. Some women learned their families were dead, their homes destroyed, their children missing. The letters were brief, bureaucratic, devastating. Others received no letters at all. They waited, hoping, but the silence was its own kind of answer. Depression spread through the camp like a slow fog. Some women stopped eating. Others stopped speaking entirely, retreating into themselves. The camp medical staff, stretched thin, under-resourced, did what they could. But there was no treatment for existential despair. No medicine for the loss of everything. A few women took their own lives. The numbers were small, kept quiet by the camp administration, but the guards knew. Everyone knew. The women found ways, hoarded pills, makeshift ropes, the cover of night. The guards tightened watch protocols, increased patrols, but they couldn't stop all of it. Despair finds a way. By late summer, the tribunals began in earnest. The Nuremberg trials were the most famous, but there were others, hundreds of smaller proceedings across occupied Germany. Women were called to testify, both as witnesses and as defendants. Some of those who had served at concentration camps were tried, convicted, and sentenced. A handful were executed. More were imprisoned. The trials forced a reckoning. They made the women confront what the regime had done, what they had been part of, even indirectly. For some, it was the first time they truly understood the scale of the Holocaust, the extent of the atrocities. Propaganda had hidden much during the war. Denial had hidden more. But now the evidence was undeniable, presented in courtrooms, documented in photographs and survivor testimony. The psychological impact was profound. Some women collapsed under the weight of it. Others clung to denial, insisting they hadn't known, couldn't have known. A few accepted their complicity and carried it like a stone. Back in the camps, those who remained tried to build some semblance of normalcy. They formed study groups, teaching each other languages, skills, anything to pass the time. They held religious services, quietly, under the watch of guards. They celebrated birthdays, weddings, yes, even in the camps. Some women married fellow prisoners, ceremonies conducted with nothing but words and witnesses, And they continued to bathe. Every week, the same silence, the same ritual, but now it carried a different meaning. It wasn't just about cleanliness anymore. It was about continuity, about maintaining a routine in a world where everything else had been stripped away. By the end of 1945, most of the women had been released or transferred. The camps began to empty. The wire came down in some places. The tents were dismantled. The fields returned to fields, but the memory remained. In the guards who had watched them, in the officers who had processed them, in the women themselves who carried the experience for the rest of their lives. Some returned to Germany and tried to rebuild. They remarried, had children, never spoke of the war. Others emigrated, seeking new lives in countries that didn't know their history. A few wrote memoirs decades later, trying to make sense of what they had lived through, and almost all of them, in their private thoughts, remembered the showers, the silence, the moment when they were allowed to be human again, even though humanity came with a terrible weight. Because being clean didn't wash away guilt. It didn't erase the past. It didn't change what had happened, what they had been part of, what they had lost. But it reminded them, for a brief moment, that they were still alive, still people, still capable of feeling something other than despair. And in the ruins of the Third Reich, that was something. There are moments in history that don't fit neatly into narratives of heroes and villains. The first bath for German women POWs is one of them. It wasn't a moment of redemption. The women who walked into those shower blocks were not absolved by water and soap. Their service to the Reich, their complicity, whether active or passive, remained. Some of them would face justice. Others would slip through the cracks of a chaotic post-war world. The moral accounting was incomplete then, and in many ways, it remains incomplete now. But that moment mattered for a different reason. It revealed something uncomfortable about war and humanity. That even the defeated, even the enemy, even those who served monstrous regimes, are still human beings. They still suffer. They still feel shame, fear, grief. And when they are treated with basic dignity, something shifts. Not in the grand machinery of justice, but in the small, individual space where a person exists. The silence that fell over those camps, the silence of guards and prisoners alike, was not agreement. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition. A recognition that the boundaries between enemy and person, between guilt and suffering, are not as clear as war demands them to be. The guards who witnessed it carried that silence home. Many of them struggled for years with what they had seen, not just the horrors of the concentration camps, but the aftermath, the complexity of occupation, the task of guarding people who were both perpetrators and victims of a system larger than any individual. The women carried it differently. For some, the memory of that first bath was a moment of profound humiliation, a reminder of how far they had fallen. For others, it was a lifeline, a moment when they were reminded they could still feel, still exist as something other than a number behind wire. History tends to simplify. It sorts people into categories: guilty, innocent, hero, villain. But the reality on the ground in the mud of those camps was far messier. It was human, and humanity, at its core, is messy, filled with contradictions, with failures, with small acts of decency that don't erase larger crimes but exist nonetheless. The story of the first bath is not a story of redemption. It's a story of what happens when the machinery of war stops and all that remains are people trying to navigate the wreckage. It's a reminder that dignity is not the same as absolution. That treating someone humanely does not mean excusing what they did, but it does mean acknowledging that even in the darkest moments, even among the defeated and the guilty, there is still something worth preserving. Because if we lose sight of that, if we reduce people to only their worst actions, only their affiliations, only their failures, we risk becoming the very thing we claim to oppose. The silence that fell over those camps in April 1945 was not the silence of approval. It was the silence of confronting something difficult, something that didn't have easy answers, and sometimes, in the face of such complexity, silence is the most honest response. The water ran. The women washed. The guards watched, and everyone fell silent.